Well, thank you very much for that introduction, Lucinda, and it's wonderful to be back in Adelaide. A shame about the weather, though. Can I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. It's timely for us to be talking about diversity and discrimination today, in part because these are questions we need to deal with in our public debate. Recent political debates certainly underline that, and you will be familiar with the findings of a recent opinion poll which showed that something in the range of 49% of those polled by Essential Media believe that Muslim immigration should come to a complete halt in Australia. Many, including myself, were surprised by these findings because we have had a non-discriminatory immigration policy in this country for many decades, one that has enjoyed widespread public acceptance and legitimacy. To see a finding of such kind, one can, of course, question some of the methodology around it, but nonetheless, it does throw into bold relief the need for our society to make a clear and compelling case for diversity and immigration. And central to that case is our economic prosperity as a country. I know something that is at the core of CEDA's mission and work. We can't take for granted that the Australian community will always understand the benefits of immigration, of diversity, but yet I would contend that there is a compelling argument in favour of maintaining a non-discriminatory immigration policy. It goes to our nation-building ambition and aspiration, and we need to ensure that we live up to the best of our traditions as a nation of immigration. And here, there is an important role for leaders in organisations to play in ensuring that we have the public conversation that we deserve. That extends to those in corporate Australia. It extends as well to those in government. We can only hope that we will have a more edifying public conversation about diversity and immigration in coming months. That, of course, is the political background to some of the work that we've been doing around the economics of diversity and discrimination. Last year, I convened a group consisting of the University of Sydney Business School, Westpac, PwC and Telstra to investigate the state of cultural diversity in Australian leadership. We did this because while Australia is a successful multicultural society, we don't yet see that multicultural character reflected in the senior echelons of our institutions and organisation. Yes, we can celebrate cultural diversity when it involves food and festivals. By all means, we are comfortable with cultural diversity in the lunchroom or in the lobby, but strikingly, we do not yet see much diversity stalking our corridors of power. We all had an intuitive sense of this reality, but there wasn't a definitive set of numbers to affirm this. So what the group embarked on doing was to paint a snapshot of Australian leadership in business, politics, government and civil society, believing that the evidence, more often than not, will speak for itself. What we did was we identified a number of cohorts to gather this picture, or to paint this picture. We looked at the ASX 200 CEOs, we looked at the Federal Parliament, we looked at the heads of federal and state government departments, so government secretaries, directors general, CEOs and equivalents, and we looked using the university sector as a proxy for civil society, the cohort of vice-chancellors in our 40 universities. The picture we arrived at was striking. But to give you a sense of how it compares with the general Australian population, let's start by looking at the numbers here. We devised a taxonomy which aggregated cultural backgrounds into 4 classifications, reflecting the demographic history of Australian society. Those who have an Indigenous or Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background, those who have an Anglo-Celtic background, those who have a European but non-Anglo-Celtic background, and those who have a non-European background. And using research conducted by Diversity Council Australia, that's the baseline that we have. About 68% of Australians have an Anglo-Celtic background, 18% have a European background, 11 non-European, 3 have Aboriginal cultural background. If anything here, we've underestimated the non-European component of the population. It could be as high as 17% based on other extrapolations. The reason why we've had to estimate this is that cultural background is not something specifically, is not something that is specifically covered in the census data that the Australian Bureau of Statistics gathers. We have very good information, for example, on the proportion of people who are born in Australia. That's 20, or outside Australia. So 28% of the population we know are born outside Australia. Another 20% have a parent who was born outside Australia. We have pretty good figures on the number of people who speak a language other than English at home, about 20%. But on the question of cultural background, it's difficult to have an authoritative number. So that explains why we've had to conduct some estimates here. But here's how the ASX 200 cohort of CEOs compares to that. We found that 77, or almost 77% of the 201 CEOs have an Anglo-Celtic background, a roughly proportionate representation of European non-Anglo-Celtic backgrounds, but low representation of non-European backgrounds and non-existent representation of Indigenous backgrounds. If you look at the Federal Parliament, these are updated figures for the new Parliament. We find something similar, almost identical in fact. If we look at the 226 senators and members of the House of Representatives in Canberra, 3/4 have an Anglo-Celtic background, just under 20% have a European background, but again, we see an underrepresentation of non-European and Indigenous backgrounds. It gets, the representation of non-European backgrounds goes down to 0 when we look at the federal ministry. So this is looking at the 40-odd cabinet ministers, ministers and assistant ministers in the federal government. The 2.4% there that we see for Indigenous backgrounds is reflective of Ken Wyatt's status as assistant minister. But you see there a disproportionately high representation of Anglo-Celtic backgrounds. When it comes to the public service at the federal and state levels, the picture is again consistent. Here it's the most striking part of the pie chart is perhaps the 0.8% of non-European and Indigenous backgrounds. Now, to put that into absolute terms, that represents one head of government department who has a non-European background and one who has an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. This is a cohort of 124 government departmental secretaries and directors general. And if you look at our universities, you get this picture. Until very recently, there was not one Vice-Chancellor who has either a non-European or Indigenous cultural background. That's changed with the new Vice-Chancellor of the University of Canberra commencing his post earlier this month. But again, a very consistent pattern. So across all the sectors of our society, in all of our key institutions, you get a pretty definitive picture here of what Australian leadership looks like. It's fair to say that the ethnic and cultural default of Australian leadership remains Anglo-Celtic. And that should prompt us to ask, are we doing as well as we'd like to believe we are as a multicultural society? Why aren't we seeing more leaders from culturally diverse backgrounds? I mean, there's no question of underachievement, is there, when we look at our high school students or our university graduates? If anything, there's an over-representation of cultural diversity among our top-performing students and graduates. If we were to look at the graduate intakes in many of our large organisations and institutions, again, there's no issue of cultural diversity being represented. These numbers do raise a question about whether there are barriers to cultural diversity coming through the ranks, and questions about exactly what kind of barriers that may involve. This research was prompted in part by the many conversations that I've had with professionals in our society who've said to me that they don't feel that they can make it to the top of their profession or their industry, particularly if they come from non-Anglo-Celtic backgrounds, and they feel that their best prospects of success are to go overseas and to explore the opportunities they may enjoy in Hong Kong or in the United States or elsewhere. That would be a really sad scenario for our country to be in. If we were to be a country that nurtures talent from our multicultural society only to see the cream of that talent deciding that they have to go overseas in order to succeed. This should be something that jolts us into a serious reflection about whether we live up to our standards as a society that places a fundamental importance on a value of fairness. The fair go is totemic in our society. We pride ourselves on being egalitarian and being meritocratic, but the numbers perhaps indicate that we're not seeing that being played out. We've identified 5 areas where we believe change can occur, but before I go into to that, I do want to highlight some of the cultural dynamics that may be at play here. I believe that if there is a barrier to cultural diversity, it involves the assumptions that we have about leadership, and that can involve both an assumption about who's fit to be a leader and also assumptions about people from certain backgrounds. I'm often asked by new acquaintances or strangers what I do for work. And I usually tell people that I work at the Australian Human Rights Commission. But I can tell you that there have been many occasions when my new friend will then jump to ask me, out of curiosity and in genuinely friendly terms, do you work in the IT section or the finance section of the Commission? I'm told that it's because I wear glasses. I'm sure all of you who are here today who wear glasses get asked this all the time as well, right? But maybe there's something else about my physical appearance that may be prompting people to conclude that I'm likely to work in finance or IT. Don't get me wrong, some of my best friends work in finance or IT, but it is an interesting insight into that, into the cultural assumptions we have. And some of the cultural assumptions I put up on the screen here. What may be reflective of a cultural default that some may have, for instance, a respect for authority or seniority, may be interpreted as deficiencies in leadership. This can play out in the meetings or discussions that you have in your organisations. If there's someone who's there in your meetings who may not necessarily dominate the discussion or talk a great deal, people may conclude that this person doesn't have anything to contribute. they may be asking, they may just be waiting for someone to ask them for their contribution, because it may be part of a cultural setting where they don't believe that they should be boasting about their insight unless they're being asked to share it. These dynamics may seem to be quite nuanced and subtle, but I do believe that they play out when it concerns leadership. But coming back to the areas where we believe improvements can be made. First, you need to have committed senior leadership on cultural diversity if you are going to see change. By that, I mean you need to have CEOs, government department secretaries, vice-chancellors, and also their deputies and others to send the right signal on cultural diversity. Too often, when we think about diversity, we think only about one dimension of diversity, and that's gender. I've had CEOs, chairmen, heads of public agencies tell me that on diversity, they're setting targets on women for the next 2 or 3 years. It's part of their strategic plan, but they don't have enough bandwidth to deal with culture. It'd be too difficult if they were to do 2 things at once. But don't worry, once the gender issue has been dealt with, there will be enough bandwidth to come and deal with culture. Now, we've made progress on gender equality in recent years, but the work of gender equality is by no means complete, far from it. If we were to wait for the work of gender equality to be accomplished before we deal with cultural diversity, the issue may be put on indefinite hold. This is what I mean when I say there needs to be a good signal on cultural diversity. Because imagine if you're someone from a culturally diverse background and you hear this from your organisational head or your CEO. If you hear, namely, that your issues or your professional development may not count in that organisation. I think that's a really important and fundamental requirement of change. In addition to that, you need to have systems in place and you need to have a culture that is conducive to diversity. By systems, I mean, in the first place, collection of data on cultural diversity. At the moment, there's still no uniform methodology or no authoritative methodology on how you collect cultural diversity data. The work that we've done through the blueprint on cultural diversity and inclusive leadership is meant to start a conversation about what that methodology could involve. And we've landed on a methodology, as you'll see, where you can aggregate cultural backgrounds into a number of categories which will give you, we believe, a good reflection of what cultural diversity looks like. You also need to think, after you've collected data, about targets. There's inevitably a question that will be asked on targets and diversity, which is that of merit. Will setting targets on cultural diversity or gender diversity, it could be as well, would that compromise the ideal of merit? Shouldn't we be making decisions about advancement and promotion based on the best person for the job rather than their background? Now, often this question can act as a veto of any meaningful discussion of targets. But the right question to be asking on this is, what does one mean by merit? How do we define merit? And who decides what merit should mean? Because when it comes to leadership decisions, or decisions about leadership positions, the higher you get up in an organisation, the more subjective it becomes. And quite often we will have discussions about whether someone has the right fit with an organisation or for the role, or whether they're ready for the role, and those ideas can be code for something else. Which brings me to bias and discrimination, which is the first issue that you need to get right about an organisational culture. We know that bias exists. Lucinda touched on some of the dimensions of that. Some of it's unconscious, some of it's conscious as well. On the unconscious front, we have very strong evidence of bias based on culture and race playing out in employment in Australia. If you have a Chinese name, your chances of being invited to interview for a job will be a lot less when compared to someone with an Anglo-Saxon name. This is based on research done by ANU about 6 years ago, where they sent out 5,000 CVs with identical qualifications, all involving people born in Australia and speaking English as a native speaker, effectively. But they found that if you had a Chinese name, you had to apply 68% more times than someone with an Anglo-Saxon name to be invited to interview. If you had a Middle Eastern name, 64% more times. The only surprise was that in Melbourne, if you had an Italian name, that was a distinct advantage. That meant that you were more likely than someone with an Anglo-Saxon name to be invited to interview. But there's also very conscious forms of bias that can be at play, and we hear this, for example, through comments about people from certain backgrounds not really wanting to assume leadership positions. We hear this all the time, this assumption that, well, actually, people of certain backgrounds are just more comfortable working in back office roles or behind the scenes. They don't want to be managers. They don't like the stress of being a manager or a leader. We see this through our organisation. We've seen this over many years. Diversity Council did a study about Asian background professionals a few years ago, and they in fact found that more than 90% of the Asian background professionals they surveyed said that they wanted to assume senior leadership positions in their work. That should put paid to any notion that some cultural backgrounds prefer to shun leadership roles and prefer to remain in middle management or in back office roles. Finally, there's professional development, and I'll conclude on this point. If there are forces at play which prevent a trajectory for culturally diverse talent that we would expect playing out, they can involve a top-down element, so bias or structural barriers acting as a pressure that is applied downward towards cohorts of diverse talent. But there may also be a lack of propulsion pushing that talent through. If we are to tackle the question of organisational culture, you need both to deal with bias and discrimination, but also do more to nurture the talents of those with culturally diverse backgrounds. And that's going to form some future work that we're exploring with the University of Sydney Business School, and the hope is that next year we'll be in a position to pilot a leadership fellowship program that will be designed to secure a pipeline of culturally diverse talent, but also raise understanding of the nuances around cultural diversity. And supporting that too will be a leadership council that I'm establishing. This will consist of CEOs and senior leaders from business, government, and civil society that will provide visible and prominent leadership and advocacy on cultural diversity, because we've seen the impact that leaders can make on diversity issues. You look at the gains that have been made on gender equality in recent years at groups like the Male Champions of Change, which my former colleague Liz Broderick established. Something similar needs to happen on cultural diversity as well. But the challenge is an ongoing one. It's not confined just to senior leaders or those who are affected by cultural diversity issues. This is an issue that should be a responsibility for all of us, because it says a great deal about the kind of society we are and the kind of society that we aspire to be. Thanks very much.